Hello, and welcome to the Foresight Center's webinar that is titled, Who Should Pay the Higher Education Bill? We are really happy to have a foreign guest today, and therefore this seminar will be in English, but I make a brief introduction in Estonian, and then we will continue in English. Head seminaril osalejad, Arenguseire Keskuse selle aasta üheks uurimissuunaks on kõrghariduse tulevik. Ja selle uurimissuunaga me selgitame kõrghariduse trende ja tulevikusuundumusi, mõtleme läbi, millised on neist tulenevad võimalikud stsenaariumid ning tegelikult kolmanda suurema uurimisteemana selgitame kõrghariduse rahastamise mudeleid ja nende tulevikukindlust. Et see kõrgkoolide ja kõrghariduse rahastamise küsimus on väga tugevalt päevakorral ja see on teravnenud olukorrani, kus kõrgkoolide rektorid ei ole enam valmis sõlmima riigiga halduslepinguid praeguse rahastuse tasemel ja avaliku sektori kõrghariduskulude osakaal SKP-st või sisemajanduse kogutoodangust on langenud 1,1% juurde ning kõrgkoolide hinnangul on praeguse süsteemiga jätkamise korral vaja jõuda selleni, et rahastus kasvaks €100 miljoni võrra aastas. Avalikus diskussioonis on arutatud erinevate võimaluste üle, kas ja kuidas kõrghariduse rahastamisega edasi minna Eestis. Ja tänasel seminaril selgitamegi kõrghariduse rahastamise suundumusi Euroopa riikides ja kuidas suhestub nende trendidega siis Eesti kõrgharidusõppe rahastamise süsteem. Loodan väga, et see seminar pakub uusi mõtteid kõrghariduse rahastamise debatti. Lisan veel, et esinejatele on võimalik esitada küsimusi ja kindlasti julgustan seda võimalust ka kasutama. Et kui te vaatate siis Zoomi akna alumises servas, leiate ikooni Q&A, küsimused ja vastused, kuhu saate siis oma küsimused kirja panna. Lisan veel, et me lindistame tänase arutelu ja see lindistus on hiljem leitav Arenguseire Keskuse kodulehekülje pealt ja tegelikult ka Facebooki lehe pealt. Ma jätkan nüüd siis inglise keeles. Dear speakers, dear participants, I'm really glad to welcome all of you at today's webinar. This webinar contributes to our Foresight project of the future of higher education in Estonia. The purpose of the project is threefold, so to say. First, we explore the trends and also uncertainties that are driving the future of higher education. Second, we create a set of scenarios describing the different possibilities of the higher education in 2035. And the third, and also very topical issue, is the financing models of higher education. And we will discuss today that the level of state financing to the higher education has been in decline in Estonia. And there is a public debate how to continue basically, and what is the long-term approach, how to make this financing model future-proof. I also say that the Foresight project is ongoing, and we are presenting the final results at the end of the May or maybe at the beginning of June. So a couple of months to finalize the results. So today's seminar gives us a better understanding of the trends of higher education financing in OECD countries. What are the main principles and how it has changed? Also, what is the outlook for the future? We can then later discuss how this Estonian system is positioning towards these trends. And I am really pleased to have good speakers today. The main speech will be delivered by Professor Kristof De Witte. Kristof is a professor in education economics and political economy at the Catholic University of Leuveni. He is also holding a chair at Maastricht University. He has published more than 100 papers in the Web of Science publications in the fields of education economics, performance evaluation, and political economy. So we are really happy to have you here and presenting at our webinar. The second presentation will be delivered jointly by Kaire Põder and Triin Lauri. Kaire is a full professor at the Estonian Business School She has published in several high-level journals in the fields of higher education economics and education financing. And Triin Lauri is an associate professor of public policy at the University of Tallinn and reviewer in several international journals. So we have really high quality panel today. And I'm also pleased to announce that we have a member of Estonian Parliament, former Minister of Education and Science, and also former Minister of Finance, Mr. Jürgen Ligi, who is going to reflect his views on the topic. But I think now I give the floor to, or actually the Zoom window, to Professor Kaire Põder, who is our lead expert on higher education financing, and who is going to lead today's webinar and going to facilitate the discussion after the presentations. So please, Kaire, Zoom is yours for the opening words.
Thank you, Uku. It is, of course, a pleasure to be here, and it was pretty funny that you revealed the number of publications in case of Kristof, but somehow hide the number of publications in the case of Estonian females. So, but yeah, of course, I have the honor to lead this session today. I know Kristof quite many years already, and the opening words from my behalf as coming from the perspective that, of course, the political debates in higher education that is always kind of going to the direction that there is no enough money. And also voters kind of don't deny this often as well, what Triin will debate later on in this broadcast today. But what we sometimes forget about is that it's not only a question how much, but it's also a question of how. And by that, I mean, what are the systems of financing or mechanism of financing of universities? And not only university financing is the issue, but also student financing, which we often here in Estonia, if not neglect, maybe it's exaggeration, but at least we don't debate it too often. So far we Estonians do policy borrowing mainly from Finland. So I guess now it's time to look at the other countries. And Kristof is coming from Flemish region, if I'm pronouncing English words correct. I guess in Estonian it's Flaamid. So it's a part of Belgium. If you take the plane, it will take 2.5 hours and then a bit of the train. So it's as far away from us as Brussels. So Leuven is the core where Kristof is right now, isn't it? So welcome, and the agenda is the following. You have your 45 minutes, and then we take the screen from you. So please take over, steal the screen, upload your slides, and I try not to intervene and mute myself starting from now on.
Okay, very good. Thank you very much, Kaire and Uku, for the invitation for the seminar. So indeed, I'm Kristof De Witte from Leuven University in Belgium. You can find the slides. So in the slides, there will be quite a bit of information and quite a bit of data. So if you go to this website, fab.kuleuven.be/leer, you will be able to download the slides from there and to have an, I only have 45 minutes. So if you are eager to dig deeper into the slides and into the numbers, feel free to download them from this place. So I'm indeed part of Leuven Economics of Education Research, which is a research group focusing on education, but looking to education from an economic perspective. And that's, of course, why I was very happy to see the invitation to discuss a little bit the funding mechanisms in higher education. And I would like to compare in the next 45 minutes a little bit the system in Estonia to the system in Flanders, this Flemish case. Because I think it's a very didactic case. The OECD says Estonia is comparable jurisdiction to Flanders, so we share a lot of common elements. Also in terms of secondary education financing, for instance, we consider typically Estonia as a kind of best practice in terms of funding, in terms of how the outcomes are. And that's why I think that, this didactic case of comparing Flanders towards other OECD systems, towards Estonia, might be very relevant. And a lot of the information and background documents arise from this document here. It's a very recent publication from the OECD. So if you're eager to, or if you would like to know more about the mechanisms about the specific case, have a look at this publication. So what I'm going to do in the next 45 minutes is first setting the scene a little bit. So what about the finding? What about the funding as such? What about spending, public spending in higher education? How is education spent? What are the issues in higher education? Next, I'm going to become more in detail looking at the funding models. So how is higher education typically funded? And what about performance-based funding? What is the issue in performance-based funding, and what can we learn or can't we learn from that? And then finally, I'll come to an issue which plays a lot in Estonia. It's a broad access to higher education. How can we look at grants to loans in higher education funding, and how can we open higher education for as many people as possible? Okay, so first, public spending in higher education. And so you see that in many countries, there is a considerable amount of money going from the public budget, the overall government, towards tertiary education. In Flanders or in Belgium here, this is Belgian data, about 83% of the total budgets for higher education is coming from public resources. In Estonia, as you will see in this blue bar, it's about 70%. So about 70% of the budget in Estonia is coming from the public budget, and that's more than, as you see, the OECD average. If you then look to the education per student, because of course this matters as well, you see that there's quite a bit of variety, and again I'll highlight the Flemish case with the Estonian case, but you see here the expenditures per student, and you see that the overall expenditure per student is about 30% lower in Estonia than it is in Flanders. It's slightly below the OECD average in Estonia. Flanders is way above this OECD average in terms of spending per student, but in both Flanders as well as in Estonia, you see that the majority of the spending is coming from this government. So the blue bar, it's considerably higher than the other bars. In Flanders, there's only tuition fees, which adds up to that. In Estonia, it's a bit more diverse, but you see that the majority of the funding is coming from public money, and that it's considerably lower in Estonia than in other countries, or at least than in Flanders. If you delve a little bit deeper into those numbers, so these are the same numbers here, but split a bit differently. So here I split this, or this OECD graph is splitting this according to the destination of funds. So what about the money, and where is the money going from? And you see that the money in Flanders here, again, this red area, is mainly going to the spending, the overall spending, the teaching, etc. And about 34% is going about 40% is going to R&D, so to research and development. If you compare this again to Estonia, you see that in Estonia, the part for research and development is a bit lower. So it's about 34% compared to the 40% in Flanders. But that also, this private spending is much more higher. So you see that about 70% is coming from tuition fees, and all kind of other private elements, whereas in Flanders, this is only 6%. So we do have very low tuition fees in Flanders, about 970 euros. So it's really the idea of having open access to people, low tuition fees, but people can just enroll, and then the government is spending a lot of money on that. I'll come back to this in a moment. But you see, so in terms of what is going on with the money, there is a little bit of difference, and Estonia is not very different from other countries in that perspective, but slightly different from Flanders in the sense of less money to research and development. And then if you look a little bit to the trends, the evolution over time. So here is the evolution between 2012 and 2017. And definitely in Flanders, if you compare to other countries, you see that this private share in spending is increasing. And so we ask more money to students. Tuition fees are increasingly considered as a way to see also equity, to safeguard sufficient funding. So we have this open system, everybody can enroll in higher education. Typically this was with very low tuition fees, and now this is gradually a bit increased, such that the importance, and I'll come back to this at the end of the presentation, the importance of loans and grants is increasing. So we have to safeguard a little bit this compensation, or to compensate a little bit this tuition fees, there are loans and grants. But you see that, and that's the yellow bar here, there is a strong increase in private spending. There is a strong increase also in research and development. So in Flanders, we consider ourselves as a knowledge-intensive economy. So we would like to do a lot of research, a lot of R&D, a lot of spin-offs of universities. And of course, this is funded by the government in terms of fundamental research, which is growing rapidly over time, more than many other countries. Whereas the core public spending on core services, on teaching, for instance, is slightly decreasing over time. So you see slight change over time towards the spending pattern. And that's quite different from other countries. So Kaire already mentioned Finland, for instance. So in Finland, you see that there is a massive decrease in public spending on core and auxiliary services. And there's also this decrease in private spending and a decrease in the public spending on R&D. So you see that education systems, they tend to differ a bit in terms of how the system evolves over time. What we do have in common with Estonia and Flanders is as well the issues. So both in Estonia as well as in Flanders, we do have relatively low graduation in time. So at the first 3 years of a cycle, the nominal duration of a normal bachelor degree, for instance, we have only 30%, a little bit more than 30% of the students who's graduating on time. And that's, of course, due in Flanders to this open access system. So everybody can enroll, whether you're coming from a vocational track in secondary education, from a technical education track, or from a pre-university track. Everybody can just start in higher education, both at universities as well as in universities of applied science. So it's completely open. But you see that, of course, this comes at the cost of having low graduation in time. If you look a little bit beyond the first due time, so that's the bars here. So it's the nominal duration plus 3 years. So both in Flanders as well in Estonia, you see that this rises up to almost 70%. So that's slightly better. But still, of course, it's an issue because similar delays are costly. So it's a very significant cost for the education system to have a delay and to fund students for multiple years in addition. But that's something we have in common, and it's of course also an element, a design element of the system on how you perceive the system and how you fund the system. Another element that we have in common is that, if you have this degree, if you have a higher education degree, it matters on the labor market. So both in Flanders as well as in Estonia or in Belgium, these are Belgian data, you see that the degree matters. So this is the employment rates of young people, so 25 to 34 years old, by their graduation program. And if you are graduated from university, for instance, from tertiary education, you see that both in Estonia as well as in Flanders, you have very high probabilities of having a good job later on, good earnings. So these are just employment rates, but earnings, of course, are higher. And this differs differently in the Belgian case. You see that this bar is much longer. And so if you have a vocational coming from below upper secondary, so if you're a school dropout, then you don't have very good prospects on the labor markets. This differs a bit in Estonia, where almost everybody has good prospects, so even school dropouts. But of course, the higher the degree, the better you end up on the labor markets. And that's, of course, showing the importance of higher education in terms of individual employment rates, individual earnings, etc. Okay, this was just to overview a little bit, to get you a little bit into the context and into the topic, and just to set the scene. And now we're going to have a look to the funding model. So funding mechanisms, there are basically 3 big blocks that you can look at. And so first, you can, of course, look at the private components. The private components, it's driven by the demand side, and these are mainly the tuition fees. So people, they pay if they enter a university or if they enter the University of Applied Sciences. And the tuition fees, of course, they end up in the private component, what I just showed you a moment ago. But of course, definitely in the Flemish case, this is heavily regulated, and we can't ask as a university more than this 979 euros for a full program for 60 ECTS points. which is about this 5–6% of the budget that I showed you a moment ago. But so that's kind of regulated by the government definitely in Flanders, but also in many other countries. But that's one mechanism, of course, to raise money out of students. A second mechanism to raise money out of students is by getting money from the government. It's the public spending. And this can be either supplier oriented, so in which the money directly flows to the institution. So the operating grant is directly given from the government to the institution, or this can be demand oriented. And in a demand oriented system, it's a student who gets the money, and the students, they just spend the money to the institutions in which they enroll. And that's, for instance, the case in Lithuania. So Lithuania is one of the, I'll come to this in a moment, but one of the education systems which have this demand-oriented mechanisms in which the money is given to the student and then the student is spending it. In most other countries, we do have supplier-oriented mechanisms in which the government is immediately giving it the grant to the institution. If you have then this supplier-oriented mechanism, also, which is the most common mechanism, so typically there is a kind of block grant given to the institution. It's a fixed amount of money, kind of lump sum given to the institution, and then the institution can do whatever it wants with this amount of money. So it can pay people, it can pay professors, a secretary, etc. So it's up to the institution. That's lump sum. So the government is not earmarking it, so they don't say you have to use it for this or that, but it's up to the institution. And typically this is composed of several elements. So typically there is, for instance, a weighting mechanism to see how should we invest the capital investments, the building, the infrastructure, the ICT infrastructure, etc. That's typically specific grants for capital investments. Next to that, there are typically grants for research, in which, for instance, publications counts, in which, for instance, PhDs counts, the type of publications. And based on those publications, on PhDs, etc., institutions, they get more or less money. And that's a specific grants for research. And then third, the majority of the grant, of course, the large part of the grants is giving to the teaching and institutional operations. And that's what we call this basic grant, which is the largest part in most education systems. And so here in this graph, you can see a little bit how this is divided. So for both the Flemish community, so we see that in universities and university colleges, so that's University of Applied Sciences, this teaching grant is for universities of applied sciences, they do have less research. So almost all of the budget is coming from this basic grant for teaching, 94%. In universities, this is almost half of the budget is coming from this teaching. Half of the budget in the Flemish case is coming from the research. And that's very similar to other education systems. So if you look at Denmark, for instance, if you look at Finland, for instance, so 42% is coming to the teaching, 34% is going to the research grants, and then there are also some specificities based on the education system. Okay, so you see, so that's a little bit how this structure is built. So you do have, in terms of mechanisms, so private money to the tuition fees, and then if you are oriented, it's supplier-oriented mechanisms, demand-oriented. In the supplier mechanisms, there is a block grant and a large amount of money, which is then come up with weights, etc., on the institution and given on the teaching. Question is, of course, how should we construct something like that? And because, of course, that's the real funding mechanisms. That's typically with formulas, etc. But there are different systems, different ways of how education systems see those construction of this budget envelope. So this amount of money, this block grant, is typically divided in different ways. And so first of all, you can, of course, say, we do have a particular budget. And that's, for instance, what happens in Denmark, in Scotland, and Australia. We do have a particular amount of budget. And so that means that we have a maximum number of students. And so in those education systems, so both in Denmark, in Scotland and Australia, they fund a maximum number of students. In Lithuania, the same thing. They fund a maximum amount of students based on the merit. So students who qualify and do have particular merits, have particular grades, etc., they don't pay fees, and that's what the government is paying. So that's based on enrollment measures, and that's like a fixed cost per student, such that this is a closed envelope. So the government determines a priori in advance what is the budget that we're going to allocate, and they do know the number of students, of course, and as such, that's the budget they allocate to higher education. Second way is then this demand-driven. This demand-driven in which you just assign an amount of money to students, and then the student can divide it. But of course, in a similar demand-driven system, that's of course, yeah, it can increase dramatically. So like in Australia, for instance, they started with a similar demand-driven system. But if the number of students is increasing rapidly, yeah, also the budget has to follow. And of course, this has very high program costs. And that's why in Australia, they already stopped with similar demand-driven system. In England, that's still the case. So there's still a demand-driven system in which it's quite open. And then the government is following basically the students. And then a third system is a distributive process in which there is a kind of fixed envelope which is distributed among the institutions. So in the Flemish case, for instance, there are 5 universities in Flanders, and then the universities, they distribute this amount of money based on a number of criteria. And it happens the same in Finland, it happens the same in the Netherlands, in which you have a closed envelope again, so a fixed budget, which is then distributed to a number of students, okay? And so, for instance, in this Flemish case, you see here, there's this kind of semi-open budget. That's because in the Flemish case, we have a very specific element. It's what we call a click system. Click system, because if you have more students, in the first 2% of more students, the budget is still fixed. But if the number of students increases by more than 2% over the years, then we go to a next level of budget of funding. And so if the number of students increases over time, the system follows gradually over time. So in the beginning, of course, it's the kind of institutions who have to come up with scale economies to account for that. But after a while, it's the budget who follows, or which is followed. And this creates what we call here this kind of, sorry, it's the wrong side, what we call this kind of closed or semi-open budget envelope. So it's a quite unique system in Flanders, thanks to this click system in which it's fixed to a given amount, to a certain extent. So if the number of students increase dramatically, it follows the number of students. Okay, but the question is still, yeah, if you have a similar distributive process, how do you distribute the money again? So it doesn't work with enrollment limits. Enrollment limits are to some extent a bit unfair. I think it's not always what you would like to do to fund a maximum amount of students. The demand-driven side is also a bit of difficulties because it creates this huge program cost. The distributive process, that's in some sense a nice process because you have this amount of money which you then distribute through the universities and universities of applied sciences. In Flanders, for instance, we have this system, this distributive process, and in which there's a kind of formula behind. And the formula is based on a set of parameters, which you discuss in advance with the higher education institutions. And they know that, for instance, there are both input measures as well as output measures. Input measures means that as soon as a student enrolls, for the first 60 credits in the program, then the university will receive an amount of money. It's just a little bit of money, but it's to guarantee this open access. So we do have this open access, everybody can enroll. And so we compensate the universities and the University of Applied Sciences for this entry of students. It's only a small amount of money which is going to this input measure. So students enrolling and taking up credits. The large amount of money and the majority of the weights and the funding in this formula, in this funding formula, is going to output measures. And so universities and universities of applied science, they receive more money if they succeed and if students graduate. And students, they need to have some criteria to be fundable, but as long as students receive the credits and obtain the program in the end, after a couple of years, then the universities and the institutions, they receive more money. So based on the outcome and the output, based on the output of the students, so they receive the credits. And next, of course, there are also other output measures, such as the number of PhDs, the number of publications, citations, etc. So if you publish, for instance, in better journals, if you publish more, we get a larger part of this pile of money and a larger part of the budget. But of course, it's competition. It's a competition between universities because there is this fixed amount of money, depending on the click system, but still fixed. And that's the way you distribute the money according to the universities. Okay. What else you have? It's kind of digressive weighting in the sense that, one of the criteria of a good higher education funding is that it's kind of predictable and that it doesn't change 1 year by another year. So it should go a little bit, it should be a bit steady over time. And to make sure that it's steady, there is a kind of digressive weighting in the sense that what happened in the past also counts, but it counts to a lesser extent. And that's what the digressive weights are. The past still matters, the last 5 years, but it diminishes in terms of extent. So if you have a massive intake in terms of students, for instance, in the past, it still might matter in the budget, but only to a lesser extent than what it happens today. Okay. So that's the distributive process on how you can distribute it. It's based on a formula, it's based on weights, and of course that's up to the politicians, it's up to the parliament to decide on what are the weights, how do we play with that. But that's of course the nice thing. It's predictable, it's rather steady, and you can play with that, of course. In many countries, they do have this kind of formula. That's a kind of overview of what happens in a number of OECD countries. Here, this was a questionnaire among 27 OECD jurisdictions, so regions like the Flemish region, Scottish region, etc., in which they asked what kind of measures are you including in this kind of formula-based model. And then you see that it depends massively across institutions and across jurisdictions. So that might be inspiring for the Estonian case as well. But so it varies between real earnings. So what are the earnings of the students? And so that's a real outcome, of course. So that doesn't really have to do something with higher education. It's really already on the labor market. So that's not an output of higher education, but an outcome of the higher education system. And that's, for instance, the case in one country here, in one jurisdiction. It can have a look to the employment. So if you think as a society, employment matters, so you can include this in the formula, feedback, completion rates, etc. So there is quite a bit of number and quite a bit of outcomes, outputs that matter in similar jurisdictions. But you see overall that out of the 27 jurisdictions which has been asked, that in 18 of them, the number of credits, the study credits and the research income, this counts more, and the more you have from those things, the more you receive in the funding formula. Just to give you an idea, for instance, to compare Estonia again with Flanders. So here you see that also you see the Flemish case, so both universities. You see that this matters a bit for the inputs. So what kind of inputs do you use, activity elements? Most of the budget is going to the outcomes and the outputs. So credits, etc., none to the outcomes, which are labor market outcomes, etc. This only happens, for instance, in Denmark, but also in Estonia. So in Estonia, there are a few performance indicators, 3% for performance agreements. I'll come to this in a moment. None of this is for inputs activities in Estonia, and then 6% for outputs indicators. And that's quite an exception if you compare it to other countries. Quite a bit of the money is going from historical reasons, and so that's quite rare if you compare it to other jurisdictions and other settings. Okay, so this, of course, gives you a bit of an idea on how this works and how the funding can be distributed through universities, to higher education institutions. But of course, there are also alternative models. So there is the alternative model of, for instance, institutional performance agreements. The alternative model of, for instance, looking at system-wide performance goals, like the employment rates in Denmark. And you see, so it varies considerably across institutions and across jurisdictions on how this works. So like in the Danish situation, for instance, both with outputs and outcome, but also a separate budget envelope for those outcome indicators. In Flanders, it's only the outcome and outputs indicators that matter. Okay. So this brings me to this third part of the presentation. So as I said, the basic grant and how the basic grant is allocated, this varies considerably. And one of the elements are the performance agreements which are also to some extent, as I showed here, in place in the Estonian cases. So the 3%. Question is, yeah, what is the impact of that and what are the experiences abroad? And I'm going to highlight a few experiences abroad. And I'm starting with the Dutch case. I know this case very well because I was part of this kind of review committee who had to assign 5% of the budgets from higher education institutions towards the institutions. So we were a very rich institution, and so we had to discuss with the universities, with the University of Applied Sciences, on how to allocate this 5%. And so what we did is they had to create a kind of performance agreements. And so each university and each University of Applied Sciences had to say between 2012 and 2017 what they would achieve in terms of indicators. So for instance, we would reduce the dropout in the first year by that amount of students. We would increase graduation. We would reduce the switch between institutions. We would increase in the national student survey to signal the satisfaction, etc. And so universities and University of Applied Sciences, they were asked to create their own targets, and we were judging whether those targets were ambitious and realistic. And based on that, they received money. And as well in 2017, then we checked as a review committee whether they fulfilled the questions and whether they met the agreements and their own targets that they've set in 2012. And based on that, they received a punishment or they received additional money. And you see here, it's in Dutch, but you see here that there were quite a bit of indicators. And so the 7 indicators. And then, so these are the indicators in which the ambitions were met. And then there were the ambitions that were discussed. And then you see, of course, it's varied quite a bit. So some institutions, they met all ambitions, which were very ambitious. Other ones, they didn't meet the very ambitious. And as such, there was a division of the money. And these were like the agreements and the distributive process as part of this performance agreements. Okay, that's a Dutch case. This Dutch case, the main advantage of this was this increased transparency and funding of higher education dramatically. And what's going on in institutions, because the institutions, they have to signal their targets, they had to signal their ambitions for both teaching, research, and valorization. And there was a kind of open discussion thanks to this review committee, which published every year, like the agreements and the evolution, etc. So this increased transparency in higher education dramatically. There were also positive effects on the organization and the strategic focus, because the government asked the institutions to have a strategic focus. And so it's institutions to really discuss on what they would like to do. Would you like to excel in biomedical sciences and economics and R&D, etc. So there was a kind of strategic focus. It increases the pass rates, the completion rates, but not in University of Applied Sciences. And so in the second generation of performance agreements, this was slightly adapted, such that there was a kind of bonus for the institutions. There was no punishment anymore, but just a bonus. So this was the new finding. And there was more room for qualitative assessment rather than quantitative indicators. Okay, but that's a Dutch case. So one case of clear performance agreements in higher education, in which, of course, the government has a lot of leeway to highlight what it thinks it is important. Second case is in the US. In the US, there were also some performance agreements in 41 of the 50 states, with proportions from 3% as in Estonia to 100% in some states. But of course, also there was a meta-analysis. They didn't find strong impact in this meta-analysis on the impact of performance-based funding. So they didn't see a strong impact on retention and graduation. They saw that the selective institutions became more selective because, of course, if your budgets depends on what you agree with and the targets, yeah, it might matter for your incentives and what you effectively do. So they saw that this selectivity in higher education became more outspoken. And then third, that the funding disparities exacerbated. And that's, of course, the same thing that we saw in the Netherlands. Yeah, if some of the institutions receive, like here, if some of the institutions receive more money, other ones decrease their budget. Yeah, the inequality between institutions varied and increased. And that's one of the reasons that also the second generation worked with a bonus rather than with punishments. And the same finding was observed in the US. If, of course, there are more disparities, if there are more issues, then you see a larger inequality among institutions. overall finding in this literature on performance-based funding is that, yeah, if the narrower the set of the outputs, yeah, the more challenging it is. So if it's a very small set of indicators, like the 7 indicators in the Netherlands, you get all attention to those 7 indicators. If this is a broader set, it's easier to accommodate and to discuss and to look at as an institution. The Flemish case, it's not a performance-based funding in the sense of the US or in the sense of the Netherlands, but it still links with this output models. So we still have this outputs financing, and the weights in the formula, in the funding formula, are quite high for output indicators, and that's why, yeah, it's also a kind of output-linked funding model. What we do find so if you compare what happened before the funding mechanism was in place, after the funding mechanism was in place, is that it didn't lead to an improvement in the progression and completion rates. So completion rates, as I showed you in the beginning, are still relatively low. 30% of the students completing in time in the 3 years, 70% after 3 additional years. So it didn't really change its short-term impacts. We see over time that due to this open intake of students, that the time to degree increases. So it takes longer and longer and longer for students to obtain the bachelor degree and to obtain the master degree. We also see a rise in the dropout rates of bachelor students. And we see also an increase in the degree-seeking students. So there is an increase in the number of students in universities. And of course, in this Flemish case, there are a few specificities that might matter, in the sense that, yeah, for the institutions, it doesn't really matter when students are finishing. They anyway receive the money if the student is finishing. If it's in time, or if it's 1 year later, or 2 years later, or 3 years later, it doesn't really matter. So in that sense, there is no incentive for the institutions. There is also no incentive for students themselves. So students, it's an open access system, 900 euros entry, so tuition fee. So it's not that expensive for most parents. It's expensive, but not overcomable for most parents. And so there is few reasons for students to think very hard, or not to switch, for instance, or to take your chances. And a lot of students, they have spare credits in the sense that they can just, yeah, take longer for their study. And also there is few interventions for the institution, so there is few possibilities to switch among programs. So yeah, there is this few progress and intermediate progressing to students. So this as a bundle, of course, this matters in the sense that this output-linked funding model is not as effective as you would wish in the Flemish case. So in general, if you look to the higher education funding yeah, what do we learn there? So we observe that in most countries, only a small proportion of funding is performance-based, except for Ireland, in which there's a massive amount. So this happened after this Dutch case. So in Ireland, about 10% of the funding is performance-based funding. But overall, we don't find in this literature a strong impact and yeah, of similar performance-based fundings, in the same line that it's quite difficulty to avoid the perverse effects. So from higher stakes, yeah, if you get a lot of money, yeah, you increase the stakes for the system, and it's becoming more and more important to switch this. So if you have a very narrow set of indicators, for instance, yeah, you indicate a lot of time to those indicators. Okay, so this brings me to the fourth and last part of the presentation about the access to higher education. Access to higher education, why is this a very important issue? Yeah, because of this graph. So this graph shows that what is the percentage of students coming from a particular background entering higher education. And you see for both Estonia and for Flanders that we're not doing particularly well. So in Estonia, for instance, if your parents didn't complete, that's this bar here, if your parents didn't complete secondary education, only 26% of the children will go to higher education. And so you see that, yeah, there is a few people and a few persons without or few parents without a higher education degree that can send their kids to higher education. And of course, this deals with socioeconomic status, this deals with income, this deals with education track. If your parents are coming from a tertiary education, you see that it increases dramatically the probabilities to enter higher education. So if the parents had a higher education degree, yeah, about 70%, 75% of the parents of their children will eventually enter higher education. So you see that this is a kind of intergenerational mobility, which is relatively low in both Estonia as well as in Flanders. So the access to higher education, this depends on a few elements. So the performance of the secondary education system. So it's already the tertiary level. Inequality is typically put in place in a very low education level. So in kindergarten and primary education. And so everything which comes before matters to some extent. It depends on the requirements and the pathways. And so if there are multiple pathways to enter higher education, you reduce the levels and you increase intergenerational mobility. The same for the requirements, sociocultural factors, but of course also the financial support to students. And this links, of course, to the funding mechanism, to the loans and to the grants, as well as to the funding to the institutions. And with respect to the loans, this is a graph in which I compared the loans and the graphs for different education systems. And again, this OECD graph. But you see from Estonia that there are few grants and loans. And all of the system is basically, again, grants and loans, which is very similar to the Flemish system, in which all of the money also going to loans and scholarships, to grants and scholarships, not to loans. And that's different from many other education systems. So like in the Netherlands, like in the UK, for instance, and Norway and Sweden, a large part of the money is going to loans. And the difference, of course, is that, in a grant system, it's non-repayable. The student gets the money and he or she doesn't have to repay. In a loan system, it's the government who creates a kind of fund to the student, but it's typically expected that under particular circumstances, the student has to repay this loan. And that's what you don't see in Estonia as in Flanders. We do have systems with grants and grants and scholarships without loans. But in Estonia, it's relatively low amounts of money that is given there. How does it work in the Flemish system? So we do have study grants. The study grants, they are based on family income criteria, like the average that the family earns, the father and the mother, for instance. It depends also on the number of credits that the student is enrolled. If you just have a very small amount of credits, you won't receive the full grant. And then you get, like, on average, 1,800 euros in university colleges, 1,900 euros in universities. So it's significantly more than the tuition fees, because it covers also, for instance, accommodation, books, a laptop, etc. There are also tuition fee reductions for some students, but there are no loans. Next to what students get, we do have also aid to the institutions directly. And that's again in this formula. So in the formula that I discussed you a moment ago, if there are students from particular target groups, then the formula assigns an additional weight to those students such that the institution is also rewarded for that, because we know that the institution has more costs towards students from a lower socioeconomic background. For instance, they have to teach them more, they have more private classes, they have more mentoring and coaching, more facilities. And that's why the institution is also compensated for that, but also, of course, as a kind of incentive to hire or to accept similar students in the institution. And next to that, towards this direct financial institutional support, there is also indirect financial support, which comes in the form of student services. And those student services, they are like kind of operating grants, which is a considerable amount of money, about 50 million euros annually. And this goes to housing, to catering, to social services, to transports, etc. All with the idea to create a kind of inclusive university in which students from different backgrounds can come, and in which there are compensations for the housing, for instance, or social services for particular groups of students. Yeah, and that's a little bit how the system works in Flanders. So both the grants are important, as well as the direct and indirect compensations for the students. Voilà, I guess this brings me to the end of the presentations. If you would like to dig a bit deeper into this, these materials to see even more graphs, I would definitely direct you towards those 2 publications from the OECD. They are very interesting and inspiring for this higher education funding. And I'm looking forward to any questions at the end of the presentation and the end of the session. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kristof. Yeah, just to remind to the participants, I see already that in Q&As we have 6 questions proposed. Feel free to type them in any time. So we have this like 10 additional minutes that me and Triin will discuss a bit of the Estonian case and the light of this Kristof findings, and then we go to the Q&A. I will try to share my screen, so let's see how successful I am. Hopefully I am. So, okay, to reflect back, I guess all this project, what we are doing here, or this webinar is part of this project, is very much dedicated not only how much public funds universities need, but also this incentivized mechanism or how to distribute money to universities. And I guess our main finding, of course, was a kind of comparative, I don't know, the latest slides now we're working very well. So the comparative view that Estonia, small red dot on the left-hand side of this figure, is indicating that we are among of this, what I will call post-Soviet regimes of education financing, where students are by large extent neglected. So inspired by this kind of final part of Kristof's talk, that the student financing has been very much performance and merit-based in most of those post-Soviet systems. So the access and also even the fact that university education is correlating with socioeconomic status and of course the social mobility, it can be a key issue in society, is not very much debated. So what this red small dot shows is that all red dots are those systems who rely mostly on performance-based grants and by a smaller extent to the need-based grants. And all the blue dots are those, and among of those is also this Flemish part of Belgium where we have only need-based grants. Of course, I guess those who are involved in higher education know that UK is a extraordinary case, not only regarding to the amount of fees, but also regarding to this differently set student financing system, which is relying on loans. And also, by my great surprise, the one foundation I'm about to share with you was regarding to the student loans. The system, which has been in place for many decades in Estonia, is seemingly a very inefficient and untrusted by families or students themselves. So the students don't use our loan system. So what they have as a part of student financing is mainly performance-based grants. So it's a very meritocratic system. So the small dot here is not showing that we don't have annual fees at all. I mean, this very small red dot. It's just we didn't know what is the median size of the fee, because those who are familiar with the Estonian system, they know that we have conditional fees in the university, meaning that if you take the full program, to keep it simple, and take the and study in Estonian curriculum, then there is no fees. In the rest of the cases, you have to pay fees. But let's also look at the empirical evidence which are coming from the literature, and those sources are the most recent funds first, and we are relying on a set of the studies which try to be experimental or semi-experimental. It means that we at least have a certain methodologies to show the outcomes of the different finding mechanisms to the outcomes of the students. So first, regarding fees, what we know from the literature is that fees alone don't have much impact on enrollment. So even though there is a debate that it's not only fees 0-1 type of a dummy variable, but it's also the size of the fees, how high they are, which has to be considered, but there is no clear evidence on the size. What regards need-based grants, there is increasing evidence that this size of the grants and the earlier the grant starts matters for the effectiveness of this policy. So, and the effectiveness means increase of the enrollment rates, especially regarding disadvantaged students. So, as you can see, there is no evidence that performance-based grants somehow increase student access or enrollment or graduation rates. So, or graduation with nominal times was often stressed here in Estonia. So we don't have this evidence. As was also stressed by Kristof, we have evidence that the lower levels count, meaning that the school's social mix can have stronger effect on aspirations of students and socioeconomic status. So what happens in the lower levels of education regarding a segregation in higher education and social mobility regarding to that counts. And also that is not much debated in Estonia, the final part of Kristof's talk about the indirect measures for support of the students. Here they are just named as outreach policies, and there is a increasing evidence that they matter, and active guidance counseling and student services, which are not just providing a general education or information, but just also going into more student services such as counseling, psychological counseling, and all those count. And we have only evidence from US where they deal a bit more with the cost effectiveness of policies, that actually we know that early childcare policies are the most cost effective, but even if you go to the higher levels of education, then all child-related investments are cost-effective. So this is a short overview of the introduction of political arena. And now I will give the floor to Triin, who is coming from the side of the political science. And what we haven't debated too much so far is what actually voters want, and what those voters want, or what are the voters' preferences over the higher education, are highly endogenous to the system. So Triin, I will mute myself to avoid background noise, but you have to guide me. Take the next slide.
Yeah, I will. Yeah, thank you, Kaire.
Yeah, thanks.
And hello, everybody. Yes, when educational economists ask what works for different types of educational outcomes, then political scientists mainly ask who get what, when, and how. So basically, this political science-based questions, not just to look at the voters' preferences. And of course, when we assume that voters' preferences are important, then then also the question what drives those preferences is very, very important. And from the literature, we know that actually education is special from that perspective, that differently from other social policy areas, actually in case of education, higher social economic status voters prefer lean state. also, we know from this same literature that ideology matters, that actually left-leaners prefer more state involvement in the educational provision. But perhaps most interestingly, from the perspective of today's talk, we also know that actually existing institutions matter, which we call policy feedback effect. In other words, how the education is governed or provided and funded in a particular country, it influences how voters or citizens perceive education, and at the same time also influences our preferences. For instance, dependent on how education is funded, there are different types of winners and losers. So utility maximizers vote accordingly. Also, it might be the case that interpretation or ideology matters in that perspective, that, for instance, if you live in heavily privately provided educational context, then you learn to love that system, even if you know that it might cause educational inequality. So it's somehow policy legitimizes itself. And what we do now, we will walk you through very briefly through some descriptive data about educational preferences in different countries, included Estonia. So Kaire, will you just help us to, yeah. And thanks to Tallinna University, or thanks to the collaborative project between Constance University and Tallinna University, we have this opportunity to analyze educational preferences of Estonian citizens, and this data was collected as part of the wider survey ISSP, and it had one specific education module called InveDuk. And we took, or now we take 4 separate questions, one about private schooling. So whether you prefer private schooling to play an important role, whether you prefer private universities to play an important role, whether you want government to fund private schools, and whether you think parental opportunity to choose is a good thing. And we compose one index based on those 4 different sub-questions, and we will get one index. Kaire, next slide. We will have one index per person, and we call this educational preferences. The higher the index, the more conservative educational preferences are, meaning you are more pro-private provision, you are more pro-choice, and the lower the index is, you are more pro-public funding and less pro-private provision. And let's focus on the lower right figure here, where you'll see educational preferences across 9 European countries: Sweden, Italy, Ireland, Great Britain, France, Estonia, Spain, Denmark, and Germany. And surprisingly, or perhaps not, we see that actually Estonia, together with Ireland, is among the highest score. In other words, Estonians prefer private provision in education. The left lower panel at the same time shows us what are Estonians and others, respondents across other countries, preferences regarding political parties. Again, the lower the number, the more left-leaning are political preferences. The higher the number, the more right-leaning are political preferences. And again, we see that Estonia has the highest score, which means that in Estonia, voters have the most right-leaning preferences. So the main takeaway here is that based on that data, we see that actually Estonians are relatively pro private provision in education system. And these upper panels, colorful pictures, just shows the distribution of those educational preferences scores across, so whether it's a normally distributed. And you will see that in many countries, actually, there are many peaks. There are more left-leaning and more right-leaning voters. However, in Estonia, we saw only one peak, actually, which is right-leaning peak. Kaire, next slide. However, you might argue that when you put everything together, basic schooling, higher education, choice, it's not very informative. Let's take one educational level at a time. And here on that figure, you see educational preferences across those same 9 European countries, including Estonia, regarding higher education. And the upper panel asks whether government should support students, yes or no. And you see that actually, while we see that the variance across countries is not very high, everybody wants more student support. However, Estonia is among the highest level. When we ask who should get actually that support, whether it should be based on the need, so the low socioeconomic status students should get that fee, then Estonia is somewhat in the middle. When we ask whether the ones who show the best results should get the student support, then Estonia, again, very meritocratic, very strongly believes that we should give fees to those students who show best results. The middle panel in the middle asks whether government should allow tuition fees at higher education level. Here, Estonia is somewhat in the middle. And again, when we ask who should pay those tuition fees, whether richer, then the answer is no. Estonians don't think that the richer people should pay tuition fees. When we ask whether those ones who do not show very good results, they should pay tuition fees, then Estonia again in the middle. Okay, and finally, we have this lower panel where we asked whether private higher education should play an important role in country's education system. Then again, we see that actually, or not again, but when in the combined score, we saw that actually Estonians are very right-leaning and very pro-private schooling. Then somewhat surprisingly, at higher education level, we see that the score is relatively low compared to Ireland, UK, and other countries. Finally, we have one additional figure about what actually parties want, and whether parties are ready to deliver education to citizens. And here what we do, we map positive mentions, either education or welfare policies, in party manifestos of Estonian parliament election across all elections. And of course, you can understand that welfare policy actually is much wider term compared to education policies. And that's why in most of the countries, the mentions of welfare policies is many times higher compared to education mentions, which In other words, the welfare policies have much higher salience compared to Estonian education policies, And this is also the case in Estonia. However, we see that in 1999, Reform Party, but also conservative Isamaa or IRL actually mentioned education more compared to welfare policies. And we also see the same trend in 2015, where Reform Party actually mentioned education twice as much compared to welfare policies, which is actually extraordinary in the perspective of other countries. Thank you, and I'm happy to open up the discussion.
Now I have the honor to give the floor to Jürgen Ligi, who was so kind to comment our presentations and have a few insights from the policy perspective. So Jürgen, the screen is yours. I will mute myself not to create any background noise.
Thank you. I hope I have heard, but I don't know whether I've seen. I have problems with camera and everything here. But probably there is not much to add from political level. The presentations were very interesting and much more complicated than the political debate in Estonia actually is. Talking only about higher education and financing, the whole idea of almost all parties is that it should be free and then no more details, and the budget remains low after this so-called reform. To make it free, there hasn't been added much state financing. So the problem is clear. My own position is different from the average. I think financing should be shared and students should be involved on every level, and then the starting point should be that students have to pay, and after that there should be exclusions depending on some details. But generally, yes, the political debate in Estonia is very simple. No fees and that's all. But that's my conclusion. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I'll take over from here, and I have the role of the moderator of this session, and there, as I see, there is open in question and answer session. There is 6 questions proposed, and I don't know how is a good way of going regarding to the time. We have approximately 15 minutes. So maybe there is, I tried to first address questions to Kristof. There are some questions regarding Flanders system, and there is a question about the click system. That how it works, and is it a legal mechanism? Meaning, is it mandatory to government to follow it? And there is also other questions. Is there more detailed view of Flanders R&D by fields, for example? There has been a public criticism that the Estonian science system is out of sync with the needs of the economy of society. So I guess those are the 2 questions regarding to the Flemish system. Kristof, can you take over and try to answer them?
Thank you very much. There are also two questions where I already typed kind of answers, so they are within the answered questions. And let me first come back to what Jürgen Ligi said about the financing, because of course, if the debate nowadays is in Estonia more about it should be completely for free, the education system, I share this vision that that you should share the burden between private as well as public budgets. Because the benefits, the private benefits of a tertiary degree are significant, both in terms of unemployment, what I showed you the graph for, as well as in terms of wages. So once you obtain this tertiary education degree, you get huge private benefits. And a system in which you have higher tuition fees with a kind of loan, of course, or something similar, this might be quite beneficial both for society, because you aim for as many people as possible to higher education, but you reduce a little bit the pure private benefits as well. And so in that sense, I share the vision that Jürgen just said about sharing this this budget. With respect to the questions, so first question that I try to answer is one of the criticisms in universities in Estonia is that universities compete with the same programs in the same area. And this was actually, that's what I added in the chat. This was actually a very interesting paper that I shared with you from my colleagues Frank Verboven and Steen Kelgermans, that show, and the title says already the results, program duplication is not necessarily bad. And they show that if you duplicate programs, contrary to what you would expect a priori you would say, if you have two types of programs in higher education closely to each other with the same outcomes, you should try to focus it better. What they showed in their paper is that particularly in the bachelor years, that more of the more generic bachelors increase participation in higher education, because the costs to participate in a higher education system for young students, and definitely for the socioeconomic disadvantaged students, is very high if you have very specialized bachelor programs. This differs in the masters, where they show that in the masters you can have more specialization because the cost of specific outcomes are different. But so that's a first reply. I'll send you this link to the paper. If you can't access it, let me know, then I'll send you the paper. Second is about the purchasing power parities. Yes, indeed, in the graphs that I showed you from the OECD, there is no purchasing power parity, in the sense that that there are differences between systems, of course, in terms of expenses. I'll share the link with World Bank data or also education at the glance data, where they compensate with that. And then, you see indeed that there is a smaller difference between education systems once you account for the purchasing power. But still there are differences, and that's the interesting thing that's remained. With respect to the R&D, there are differences in terms of R&D. So in the Flemish system, we try to look a little bit to society as well as to fundamental research. So both elements are as important to each other. So both the non-directed research, and that's basically organized by basic research proposals. So we are allowed to provide our own research proposal to the Flemish Science Organization that is then funding it. Or not, so it depends on peer review. But so that's really bottom up, and this aims for fundamental research with no specific reason. And then on top of that, there is also kind of top-down research or research with societal impacts. And so both elements are different streams in the research funding, in which you can have real fundamental research with no specific outcome to society yet. Fundamental research in which there has to be society stakeholders involved or industry stakeholders, and then also very applied research. And this combination is relatively successful. And I have to say also Leuven University is quite successful. So if you're interested in that, you have to have a look to the website of Leuven Research and Development. That's like an organization which is the main administration for projects and funding in the University of Leuven, and they are a kind of European best practice in how to organize spin-offs towards industry, towards all kind of society, and towards society leveraging, etc. And that's how we try to make sure that there is sufficient alignment between what universities do and what society would like to have. There was a question about the Voyagers as well, and how Voyagers would work. Yeah, vouchers, education economics says that vouchers are a very good system in the sense that it allows people it's a non-distortive incentive. So it doesn't distort the incentives. You can prove this. And if you have vouchers, it works basically like a kind of feed voting. So the money follows the students. And if an institution is better than the other institution, you expect that more people will come to this institution. And so more vouchers will be brought into this institution. And as such, it feed votes. And the bad institutions are pushed away, or they are less popular, such that they have to increase their way of teaching, for instance. And as such, indeed, yeah, vouchers are typically considered as an effective mechanism to broaden access, as well as to increase competition in a system. There was a question about the click system. It's a legal mechanism indeed. So it's mandatory. It's written in a decree. So it's written in the law, and it's followed. It's automatically followed. It's very difficult for the Ministry of Education to change this. They can, if in terms of austerity, for instance, the ministry can play with other variables. They can, for instance, say we will reduce a bit of the research funding, but this mechanism, or they play a bit with the inflation, so they don't compensate for inflation, for instance. That's what they do. But changing the click system, it's quite difficult, because of course also the institutions, they account for that, or they would like to see if there is an increase of 2% of the student body. Yeah, they would like to see also this increase in terms of funding, and that's why it's mandatory. And it's automatically followed by the government. And they know, of course, beforehand. So they see this coming. They see, yeah, it's already 1% increase, 1.5% on next year. There will be an increase in this click system. And that's how they know this for budgetary reasons. There was a question also on the outcome and outputs indicators, and that this is possible for teaching as well. That's completely true. So in teaching, the quality indicators, they are, for instance, the National Student Survey in the Netherlands. So every student is required or asked at the end of the year to fill out how satisfied are you with the course and what you did. And that's a kind of quality indicator for students. In the Flemish case, that's more like the completion rates. We don't have this National Student Survey, but in the Netherlands are definitely a best practice, in which, yeah, this was part of this performance indicators to measure the quality of teaching through those self-questionnaires of students. And then finally, there was a question on the autonomy of universities and the managing, on how you can account for that. So the link with the tax systems. This was one of the ideas in performance-based funding in the Netherlands. So in the Netherlands, they had this idea we will fund within this 5% of performance-based funding. We will fund for both the teaching as well as the valorization and the mission. And so it was up to the universities and the university colleges to define their own mission. If this mission was sufficiently distinct from others, and if this mission was also sufficiently clear in terms of valorization and the merits to society, then you could have more funding than in other universities. So this what Teunis Ferry here, I pronounce it well, I hope, says about the similarities within the tax systems. So that's exactly what the aim was from this Dutch performance-based funding. And in the end, as I said, it worked relatively well. The disadvantage, of course, is that it's similar qualitative evidence. It's difficult to see, and it's difficult to define when will you fund a particular mission. So that's why we had very difficult discussions within the review commission to see what is sufficient distance, how does it align sufficient to society. But the idea indeed was that universities were autonomous and that the money would follow if you had good ideas. Voilà, I guess that I answered most of the questions.
Yeah, maybe we can address also your own feeling about this low tuition fee, the question of Aunevalk, the last one. I guess there was this debate that the cost sharing is kind of good policy in the sense that there are private benefits related with education. There are clear private benefits. So I guess the debate from 0 to 1,000 tuition fee is just a question of principle, isn't it? But then the question above it is also pretty interesting. How far can we go?
Yeah, indeed. I don't know really the evidence on that, so I should look, but I guess there is a rich literature on tuition fees. In the case of Flanders, this is definitely an ethical question. It's a political question. We do have low tuition fees, €1,000. It increased already significantly, as you've seen in the graph. So it was like €500 in the past. It increased significantly because of to guarantee sufficient access and to make sure that the universities and University of Applied Science are sufficiently funded by adding this private component. But still, if you compare it to the Netherlands, where the tuition fees is about €1,800, if you compare it to the UK, where they are incredibly high, in the UK, for instance, looking to and speaking with chancellors in the UK, this is not a good practice as well. So you get a huge competition for the students, not based on the content, but mainly based on the facilities, on the sports, and all kind of other things that don't really matter for academic success or for academic outcomes. And so I guess this is the other extreme, whether it has to be completely private and public and without tuition fees like in some countries. I don't think so as well. So I guess there is a kind of middle ground, but this is more like an personal opinion. I should really look to the literature on what is saying, but the literature is clear on the private benefits. And that's what we bring into the debates in Flanders nowadays. The private benefits of tertiary education are huge. There are significant societal benefits as well. But this is why we would like to have a low fee, but to some extent also to skim a little bit this huge private benefit.
Thanks. There is one new question emerged from a Minister of Higher Education Research about the vouchers again. I guess it seems to be a kind of increasingly important topic regarding to the concern that the students tend to prefer social sciences, law, humanities programs if the voucher programs are equally distributing money to the students. So do you have any empirical evidence on that, or do you remind any studies regarding to that?
Yeah, so so we have the same issue, for instance, in Flanders, in which we would like to have more students coming to the STEM education, so science, technology, engineering, mathematics. We try to do this by orienting students better, by having a kind of intake tests and showing what kind of outcomes do you have, by showing what is the labor market prospect, what happens in terms of wages. And so by shifting the mindset of students already at a young age. So one of the conditions to enter higher education, as I showed you before, is secondary education. So the study track, the enrollment in secondary education, triggering the interest of students. And I don't think you can, it's a bit too late to change it at the age of 18 years old, and even through Voyager's programs, because of students, they typically take a program because of their interest, because of what they think is interesting, and all of those foundations is already laid earlier before in secondary education. So rather than playing with the Voyagers, I would think that you have to start earlier and to trigger the interest there. To show the merits of STEM education, for instance, of mathematical education, already at a younger age. But that's, of course, a discussion which happens in many countries. So I'm sure there is plenty of research, definitely on STEM, so how to make sure that people choose for STEM, because that's an issue that you have in many countries, that there's too little students that choose for engineering programs, whereas too many students choose for psychology programs. And so it's a topical issue anyway in literature, but I guess it has to start at a young age.
Yeah, and it's super interesting that you mentioned more like the counseling services instead of this kind of monetary incentives. I guess the Estonian take on it, you have to pay students more in the STEM curricula to kind of lure them to the programs. And this is very different. Again, we are relying very much on this performance-based grants instead of need-based grants. So the take on higher education, I guess, has this very post-Soviet roots. I guess time-wise, we're doing fine, aren't we? Uku, can you take over and steal the screen for us? Otherwise, we can continue forever.
Yeah, I have to say the time is running fast and we have to start concluding our seminar. I think a very sort of broad spectrum of topics were covered, from these general trends to the specific student loan systems and also political preferences, which was really interesting for me. I think that the webinar highlighted some of the major differences and also the challenges the Estonian system is facing, but also give us some fresh ideas how to enrich our local debates. So I think it was really valuable. So thanks to all the panelists and participants, and especially Kaire for moderating the discussion. By the way, I counted all your 1.1 publications in ETIS, so I know it was an impressive number. So I hope you all enjoyed the discussion as much as I did, and I wish you all a very nice evening. So bye-bye.